This Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back to switch things up in Disney's Freakier Friday.
Totally, yes.
It's an absolute riot, and the only movie that can be described as
So much weirder than the last time.
What last time?
it's the frequel
You ready?
we've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
What deeply out-of-touch old person came up with that?
You did.
Wow.
Don't miss the comedy event of the summer for all ages. Disney's Freakier Friday, in theaters this Friday. Get tickets now. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested.
It's extraordinary what people say they saw at Ford's Theater that night. John Wilkes Booth was a megastar.
The American political climate has always been rife with division, but even juxtaposed against today's polarized environment, it has never been nearly as divided as it was during the Civil War. I'm Alec Baldwin. This is a story that shows how the lines are so often blurred between hero and villain, immortality and infamy, justice and vengeance, and how in that respect nothing has changed today. Listen to The Ides of April, starting July 23rd, wherever you get your podcasts.
EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. It always starts the same way, doesn't it? With a sound you just shouldn't hear. Not the symphonic cacophony of a haunted house in a movie. Not the kind of Hollywood poltergeist that shakes chandeliers and rattles the cupboards. No. The real ones, the ones that actually haunt you, they don't start with screaming. They start with a whisper. A subtle creak, a breath that doesn't belong, a footstep one room too far from where anyone should be. The kind of thing you write off the first time, and maybe the second time. But by the third, the house starts to feel smaller, like the walls are holding their breath, like something's crouched just behind them, listening. In 1986, in the gentle and unremarkable town of Pepperell, Massachusetts, the Andrews family became acquainted with this kind of silence. The eerie, listening kind. And as much as it pains me to say it, they weren't the first or the last family to mistake grief for a haunting. Welcome back to The Devil Within. I'm Brandon Morgan. This is The Boy in the Walls, the story of Daniel LaPlante. The widowed patriarch, Brian Andrews, was doing his best, a phrase that should probably be embroidered on every man's bathrobe between 1980 and 1995. His wife had died of cancer. He was working long hours, coming home late, and trying to parent two teenage daughters while navigating his own grief. The girls, Annie and Jessica, were doing what teenage girls do, searching for comfort in some way that made sense to them. Dramatics, divination, and the slightly cracked spiritualism that comes when you leave teenagers alone with a Ouija board and unresolved trauma from a recently deceased mom who died way too young. And wouldn't you know it, something answered. It began with taps, just small knocks inside the walls, innocent at first. A novelty, even. Jessica was convinced it was their mother. Annie, always the more skeptical of the two, rolled her eyes until the day she walked into her room and found her jewelry box upside down and emptied onto her bed. A week later, her diary disappeared, only to reappear in the refrigerator. A message scrawled on the bathroom mirror in red lipstick read, "I'm watching you." Which honestly is both deeply disturbing and incredibly lazy ghost behavior. Still, the girls, adrift in their grief, tried to believe it was their mother. Who else would move objects and leave messages in lipstick? A spectral Mary Kay rep? No. They told their dad. He assumed it was a prank. Maybe some neighborhood kid sneaking in. Maybe even the girls themselves. Grief does strange things to memory. And teenage girls, as every tired 80s sitcom has reminded us, are emotional time bombs. He told them, lock your windows and just go back to bed. And they did. But the whispering got louder. At one point, the girls claimed to hear someone crying through the vents in their walls. Not sobbing exactly, but the kind of wet, rhythmic breathing that doesn't belong in a furnace. The notes became more frequent and more hostile. "I live here too. Come and play." Or "Get out while you can." To his credit, Brian called the cops. They swept the house. They found no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no fingerprints. One officer allegedly suggested the girls were manifesting their own guilt, which sounds less like police work and more like something a lazy therapist with a white wine problem would say. And then one night, Annie came home to find someone in her room. He was dressed in her dead mother's clothes, wig, makeup, dress, and he was holding a hatchet, which, to be fair, is one hell of a commitment to a prank. Annie screamed, Jessica screamed. They both fled the house while Brian called the cops again. This time, the cops didn't find an open window. They found a wall, a hollowed-out panel in Annie's closet. Inside, they discovered food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and a boy. Not a ghost, not a demon, not a vengeful spirit summoned by a Ouija board. Just a kid named Daniel LaPlante. He was local, vaguely known in the neighborhood, mostly by guidance counselors and board truancy officers. He had met Annie through a prank phone call some months before and managed to convince her, without ever meeting face to face, that he was a charming, sensitive, dark-haired jock with sad eyes and, just like her, a dead mom. It turns out only 2 of those things were true. When Annie finally agreed to meet him for a date, she was surprised to find that he was not a dashing school athlete, but a twitchy, socially awkward boy who reeked of dust and disappointment. The date was a disaster, so she ghosted him. Except Daniel didn't take the rejection the way most teenage boys do, with a heavy sigh and an angry mixtape. He took it as a challenge. And he came back. Not through the front door, but through the walls. Daniel had been living inside the Andrews home for days, maybe weeks, watching, listening, emerging from the walls when they weren't home, moving objects, leaving messages, playing ghost. Because he knew something that most of us don't want to admit. It's easier to believe in the supernatural than it is to believe someone would willingly hide behind the sheetrock just to watch you brush your teeth. And if this was where the story ended, it would already be the stuff of nightmares. But of course it doesn't. Daniel LaPlante was arrested. He was evaluated. Then he was brushed off as disturbed but not dangerous. He was released back into the wild. And by the time he returned to the spotlight, he wasn't dressing up in his victim's mother's clothes. He was committing murder. But we'll get to that. There's a moment in every good ghost story when the haunting stops being metaphorical. When the sounds in the attic, the cold drafts, the flickering lights, those polite little symptoms of supernatural presence, when they become something else entirely, something pointed, focused, and directed at a target. That's the moment when people usually move out, or burn the house down, or sell the place to a new family with the clause, "Disclosure not required," written in the world's smallest font. But the thing about Daniel LaPlante was that he didn't need your house to be haunted, because he could do it himself. After the Andrews family discovered a live human being squatting inside their walls, and let's take a beat to just appreciate how fundamentally sanity-breaking that sentence is. Okay, Daniel LaPlante was removed from their home and, one would assume, from their lives. But in classic 1980s judicial fashion, he was treated like a troubled teen with boundary issues, instead of what he actually was. A deeply disturbed voyeur with an affinity for psychological warfare and women's clothing. It turned out that Daniel had a record. Juvenile stuff mostly, petty theft, breaking and entering, vandalism. The kind of charges that read like the resume of a future mugshot. His childhood had been a catalog of bad luck and worse parenting. Allegedly abused by his father and sexually assaulted by a psychiatrist, because, of course he was, Daniel was a kid who seemed to ricochet between institutions, diagnoses, and court dates. But the system, as it so often does, just shrugged and said, he'll grow out of it. But guess what? He didn't. By the fall of 1987, Daniel was back in Pepperell. Free, unsupervised, barely 17. And then he found himself a gun. It's unclear where he got it. The official reports are vague. But what we do know is that on December 1st, 1987, Daniel LaPlante armed himself, got dressed in full camouflage, and broke into a home on River Street, the home of Priscilla Gustafson, a 33-year-old nursery school teacher and mother of two. Her husband, Andrew, arrived home that evening to find the house empty and quiet, which, if you've ever walked into a house with small children, is your first indication that something is terribly, terribly wrong. He found Priscilla face down on their bed. She'd been raped, beaten, and shot in the head. Their two children, 5-year-old William and 7-year-old Abigail, were found drowned in separate bathtubs, one upstairs and one down. It wasn't chaos. It was clinical, choreographed, like someone had rehearsed it, which in a way, that someone had.
You're tuned into Auto Intelligence, live from Auto Trader, where data, tools, and your preferences sync to make your car shopping smooth.
They're searching inventory.
Oh, yeah.
They find what you need.
They're gonna find it.
You can make a budget for your wallet to help you succeed. Pricing's precise and true.
So true.
It's smarter car shopping.
Ooh.
Just for you.
Oh, it's just for you. Ooh. Find your next ride at autotrader.com. Powered by Auto Intelligence.
Canada may be known for its landscapes and friendly people, but beneath the surface lies a darker side of crime, history, and the paranormal. Since 2017, the award-winning Dark Poutine podcast has explored the shadowy corners of the Great White North and beyond, delivering chilling tales from a uniquely Canadian perspective. Hosted by Mike Brown and Matthew Stockton with over 300 episodes and fresh releases every Monday, Dark Poutine is your weekly ticket to the creepier side of Canada. Listen to Dark Poutine on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, I'm Bruce.
And I'm Jeff. We're here to tell you a little about our new podcast called Taboo Treasures. In Taboo Treasures, we explore the human obsession with objects of extreme rarity and infamy.
Yeah, we're going to get into Barbie, Hitler, one-of-a-kind soccer ball.
And, of course, drugs, guns, murders.
And cults. We hope you'll join us and learn a little and maybe even laugh a little while we tell you some of the stories behind the stories you only think you know.
Daniel was caught within 48 hours, hiding in a trash bin not far from his home, soaked, shivering, and carrying the same gun he used in the murders. He was convicted quickly. Even his defense team didn't bother arguing innocence. They just tried to prove he was insane. But Daniel wasn't foaming at the mouth insane. He was cold, calm, composed, which, honestly, is infinitely more terrifying. The details of the crime scene are honestly hard to read. Harder still to say out loud. There was no rage, there was no explosion of emotion, just method, precision. He bound the children, held them underwater, moved from room to room like he was checking off boxes on a to-do list. This wasn't a boy playing Ghost anymore. This was a boy playing God. Now, if you're looking for a supernatural angle, you can say this is where it died. The haunting was over. No more Ouija boards, no more lipstick messages, just a house full of bodies and a courtroom full of silence. But I don't think the ghost story ends here. I think it just changed shape. Because if Daniel LaPlante was never possessed by a demon, he certainly became one. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. The kind that leaves stains in places bleach can't reach. The kind that judges can't seem to just sentence away. At trial, the prosecution laid out the timeline like a surgical tray. The break-in, the confrontation, the murders, the escape. Daniel sat still for most of it, blank, flat, a 17-year-old with a baby face and a 1,000-yard stare. The boy who once played pretend behind the drywall, now being treated as a man who committed unspeakable evil. He was sentenced to 3 life terms without parole. Massachusetts exhaled. The nightmare, they thought, was over. But of course, nightmares don't end. They just evolve. Outside the courtroom, Andrew Gustafson told reporters that justice had been served, that he could finally sleep again, and that his children could rest in peace. And maybe that was true. But the rest of us, we were just left with the question, what do you do with someone like Daniel LaPlante? Some monsters are made, others are born, but every now and then one slips through the cracks, hides in the walls, and mimics the voices of the dead. And by the time you realize it's not a ghost, it's too late. Years later, Daniel LaPlante would resurface in the headlines, filing appeals, requesting access to education programs, arguing that he deserved a chance at rehabilitation. And people, well-meaning, Constitution-citing people, debated whether he was a product of trauma or just evil in its most efficient form. Because in America, we love a redemption story. But we also love a monster. And Daniel, he made it hard to tell the difference. There's a peculiar cruelty in the way time handles monsters. Not the fictional ones, the vampires, the werewolves, the Ouija planchette demons, but the real ones, the ones with zip codes and arrest records. Because for them, time has a way of blurring edges. Sharp memories dull, screams fade, photos yellow. The boy in the crawl space becomes a man in a prison jumpsuit, and we're asked, implored even, to see him differently. That's what happened to Daniel LaPlante. Not content with being a footnote in Massachusetts murder lore, Daniel re-entered the public eye nearly 30 years after the Gustafson killings. But this time, he wasn't hiding behind walls or bathroom doors. He was in a courtroom again. Only now, he wasn't pleading for mercy. He wanted a do-over. Because Daniel had something to say. He was sorry. Let's back up. It was 2017, a year full of cursed headlines, solar eclipses, royal engagements, people eating Tide Pods unironically. But also, legally speaking, it was the year a number of convicted juveniles, some now well into middle age, tried to rewrite the past. The reason? A pair of Supreme Court rulings, Miller versus Alabama and Montgomery versus Louisiana, which decided that mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders were, in essence, unconstitutional. Because teenagers, the court argued, have underdeveloped brains, because they're impulsive, they're moldable, and redeemable. And Daniel LaPlante, now a grown man with a beard and a pocket full of letters written to pen pals, saw a sliver of daylight, a chance, a legal crack in the drywall. He filed for resentencing. The court called it a hearing, but for the victims' families, it felt more like a seance, one where the ghosts had to reintroduce themselves. Andrew Gustafson was gone by then, taken by cancer in 2014. But others came forward, friends, neighbors, survivors of proximity. They sat through the testimony with the same numb grimace they'd worn 3 decades earlier. Daniel's attorneys argued that he was no longer the boy who had tied up a nursery school teacher and drowned her children, that he had endured a traumatic childhood, that he'd grown, that prison had been transformative, that, of course, he'd found religion, or at least a version of it that fit behind bars. Daniel spoke too, said he was sorry, said he thought about the Gustafsons every day, said he couldn't explain why he did what he did, but he knew that it was wrong. He used the word remorse 17 times. which is precisely how you know someone's been coached. To the court's credit, they listened, and then, mercifully, resolutely, they declined to reduce his sentence. Judge Jeffrey Kinder ruled that Daniel LaPlante should spend the rest of his life in prison. Not because he hadn't changed, necessarily, but because some crimes burn too hot. Some acts are too calculated, too sadistic, just too thorough. He had tied Priscilla Gustafson up. He had gagged her. He had raped her and shot her in the head. Then he smothered her daughter and drowned her son in a tub of lukewarm water. This wasn't a case of youthful rage. This was choreography. And the dance, the judge reminded us, had 3 victims who couldn't appeal their sentences. Daniel was escorted out of the courtroom that day and back to his cell, where, by most accounts, he still writes letters, still maintains his innocence, depending on the audience, and still signs off with "God bless," which frankly feels a little on the nose. And thankfully, that's where we'll leave him. Not as a ghost story, not as a misunderstood teen, but as a man who crawled through the walls of someone else's home and never really came out. A living reminder that sometimes evil doesn't need horns or rituals or cults. Sometimes it wears your mom's dress and waits in your closet with a hatchet. Sometimes it's just a boy who grows up to be a man who believes that time, if you wait long enough, will forgive anything. Guess what, Danny? It doesn't. This has been The Boy in the Walls, the story of Daniel LaPlante. If you enjoyed these episodes, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It helps more than you know. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For EVO Creative, I'm Brandon Morgan, your writer and host.